Hello, I'm Jason Collings, and this is Voices of the Weimar Republic, Part 3: Outsiders, Women, Exiles, and Dangerous Minds. The Weimar Republic is often remembered through its most visible surfaces: the city, the clubs, the politics, inflation, the uniforms, the mass culture, all of this drama. And fair enough, those things were certainly part of its reality. But if you want to know where the age was really under pressure, you have to look away from the centre. You have to look at the people who didn't sit comfortably inside the official story. Women writing modern life without asking for permission, Jewish writers whose place in German culture was both central and yet precarious, exiles, satirists, sexual outsiders, politically inconvenient minds. Writers who understood that the Republic's tensions were not only in Parliament or on the street, but in the private humiliations and exclusions of daily life. That is the world of our third group of writers: outsiders, women, exiles, and dangerous minds. What joins them is not one style or one politics, it's a point of view, the outsider's point of view. They don't accept the age at its own valuation, they see what it costs to live in it. Take Vicki Baum. On the face of it, one might think of her as a successful modern novelist, stylish, readable, commercially gifted. All true. But Grand Hotel is not merely a glamorous novel. It is a book about modern urban life as transit and performance. People brushing past one another in temporary spaces, half known, half staged, desiring connection, and usually getting transaction instead. Baum saw that modernity had changed social life into a theatre of encounters. That's a very outsiderish insight, even though her settings often look polished. She understands that beneath the glamour there is a loneliness and improvisation. Then there's Elsa Lasker-Schüler, and with her you move into another register entirely. Visionary, theatrical, difficult, utterly herself, she belonged to the Jewish and avant-garde Berlin that gave the Republic so much of its intensity and so much of its fragility. She didn't write social realism, she wrote inner truth in symbols, emotional states turned into language so distinctive it sounds like no one else. That matters in Weimar because not all truth comes in the form of reportage. Some of it comes in the fact of a sensibility existing against the grain of ordinary public life. Lasker Schüler's very presence tells you something about Berlin at its most brilliant, that it could still remain. That matters in Weimar because not all truth comes in the form of reportage. Some of it comes in the fact of a sensibility existing against the grain of ordinary public life. Lasker Schüler's very presence tells you something about Berlin at its most brilliant, that it could still sustain minds and selves that are too singular for ordinary categories. It also tells you something about its danger because such figures were never safe for long. Anna Seghers takes us in another direction, towards political seriousness and moral pressure. If the city writers in week one gave us nerves and the war writers in week two gave us damage, Seghers gives us conscience. She is a reminder that Weimar literature was not only clever, ironic, or stylistically daring, it could also be morally grave. Her sympathy is with people under pressure from forces larger than themselves, and her writing carries a seriousness about justice that the Republic badly needed and didn't always reward. This is important. Weimar was a place of immense sophistication, but sophistication alone is not a moral program. Seghers reminds us that some writers looked at the Republic not simply as a fascinating crisis, but as a test of what sort of human beings a modern society was prepared to become. Heinrich Mann stands beside that seriousness in a more satirical anti-authoritarian mode. He's one of the great writers of Germany's obedience problem. That may sound flippant, but it's really not. He understands that the danger to the Republic didn't come only from fanatics on the margin, it came from older cultural habits of behavior: civility upwards, cruelty downwards, admiration for power, contempt for weakness, the willingness to mistake authority for moral worth. The loyal subject remains one of the great diagnoses of that condition. That is exactly why Heinrich Mann belongs in this week. He is an outsider not merely in the social sense, but in the sense that he stood against the grain of German deference. He made obedience look ridiculous and poisonous at the same time. His nephew, Klaus Mann, takes us forward into a younger, more exposed generation. His importance lies partly in inheritance. He was the son of Thomas Mann and the nephew of Heinrich, which means he grew up inside German literary prestige while also writing from a far more precarious position. Sexually, politically, emotionally, generationally, in him you can feel the Weimar Republic not as a large historical argument, but as a condition inside the nerves: cosmopolitan, unstable, self-aware, suspicious of falseness, and unable to rest in inherited authority. He is one of the voices through which modern identity, especially queer identity in youth under pressure, begins to sound unmistakably 20th century, possibly in some cases even 21st. That is not a side note to Weimar. It's one of the central truths. The Republic opened social and cultural possibilities that also exposed people to new kinds of scrutiny, anxiety, and danger. Then there is Mascha Kaléko, one of the most quietly devastating voices of Berlin. She matters enormously because she writes the everyday city from a position not often treated as central enough in traditional histories. Jewish, female, urban, intimate, ironic, and wounded. Her poems understand rented life, modern fatigue, and the melancholy hidden in ordinary routines. She hears the private sadness inside metropolitan wit. That makes her indispensable. Big histories of Weimar often lean on spectacle. Kaléko gives you the street level scale: a room, a tram, a mood, a feeling of loneliness. The city seen not from the grand cafe table, but from where people actually endure it. And finally, Ernst Toller, whose significance lies in the pain of failed hope. Toller is the voice of idealism, betrayed and wounded by history. A revolutionary, playwright, prisoner, and a man who believed transformation had been possible and had to live with the failure to achieve it. He brings into the Weimar record something emotionally crucial: not cynicism, but grief. Grief for a world as it is, and grief for what he once thought it might become. That is where the week begins to cohere. Baum gives us performance and transit. Lasker-Schüler gives us visionary singularity. Seghers gives us conscience. Heinrich Mann gives us anti-authoritarian satire. Klaus Mann gives us exposed modern selfhood. Kaléko gives us urban melancholy at the human scale. And Toller gives us damaged idealism. What they share is their angle of vision. None of them are content to speak from the comfortable centre of the stage. They are all in one way or other writing from positions that reveal the strain inside Weimar society. And This is where it becomes useful to widen the frame, because these seven are not alone. Around them are a whole literary ecosystem, often neglected when people tell the story only through the great male modernists. There are women's novels, city novels, office girl novels, hotel novels, serial fiction, social observation written for mass readership, erotic fiction, scandal fiction, popular literature dealing with desire, class, reinvention, and the precarious freedom of women in the metropolis. Some of this writing is entirely forgotten now, not because it was unimportant, but because literary history has often been focused too narrowly. This is particularly true of popular women's writing and erotic fiction. Weimar was full of texts dealing with female mobility, sexual bargaining, the city as temptation, fashion as labour, romance, humiliation, and sex. Some of it was high literature, but most of it wasn't. Most of it was what we would frankly call pulp, but that doesn't make it socially trivial. On the contrary, these books and magazines often tell you what the public at large wanted to imagine, fear, justify, and secretly rehearse. In other words, they reveal the Republic's emotional economy. The same goes for the erotic literature more broadly. Weimar Germany's reputation for sexual openness didn't emerge from nowhere. It was supported by a world in print which curiosity, scandal, desire, and self display, and the commercialization of intimacy all had their market. Some of this was exploitative, some of it was emancipatory. Much of it was both at once, and that ambiguity is very Weimar. And it all belongs inside the literary story. A republic under pressure often reveals itself most clearly not only through its masterpieces, but in what it consumes privately and sometimes guiltily. The pulp novel, the erotic pamphlet, the women's magazine, all of these belong to the age's self understanding. They tell you what forms of female life, particularly, could be imagined, what forms of sexuality could be marketed, what anxieties could be flattered, and what sorts of freedom were exciting precisely because they didn't yet feel secure. That's why I wanted this third week to open up the frame a little. Weimar literature is not only a story of canonical men wrestling with civilization and the great questions of the day. It's also the story of voices writing from positions far less secure, less official, and often more revealing. The outsider often sees more. The person not fully sheltered by the culture hears the falseness in it sooner. The woman moving through the city with fewer protections understands the price of modernity differently. The exile recognizes what the insider still denies. This is one of the reasons Weimar remains so rich. Its literature doesn't give us one story. It gives us competing angles, competing moral temperatures, and competing distances from the center. And if you want the Republic whole, you need all of them. You need the city and its nerves, you need the war and its damage, and you need the voices that stood aside and therefore saw what the center couldn't see for itself. That's the work of the outsiders, and that's why this final group matters so much. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this study into the voices of the Weimar Republic. Please subscribe for more.